Time to say good morning to Alan Quinlan. Alan, how are you getting on? What's the crack?
Yeah, I'm good, Jaron. Yourself?
Oh, good, yeah, surviving. We wanted to talk to you what you make about what's going on with World Rugby at the moment, because David McWilliams had a great line around the time of the last recession that we were in about when the tide goes out, you get to see who's been swimming naked. And it turns out a lot of the rugby unions have been, and a lot of the leagues have been swimming away naked, putting their best face forward, but actually underneath, not much substance there. So the Premiership is in trouble, the RFU are in trouble, the Australian Rugby Union is in trouble, the Six Nations itself as a bloc are probably in a bit of trouble, and we have one of the most important elections in sports administration history going on at the moment, where Bill Beaumont is up against Pichot, and it's hard to know what we should be rooting for as an outcome.
Yeah, it is difficult. I think the current pandemic will probably awaken a lot of unions, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, as to their financial positions and the dangers that, and probably the lack of potential investment and growth financially that a Nations League, which was proposed last year, which was knocked back, could generate. I think there was a real fear when that proposal was put in place that it came from some of the Six Nations teams about relegation. 12 teams in a Nations League playing in similar windows, so the Six Nations would still continue, summer tours would continue, and November internationals, but the summer and November internationals would now be league games, and at the end of that year there would be the possibility of relegation. So I think there was a real fear from Six Nations teams, and we've had this debate before. It's kind of ongoing about Italy's participation in Six Nations. Should there be a relegation there? Should Georgia, Romania, Russia, somebody else come into the Six Nations and have an opportunity to play there? So it's driven by finances, and I think this will be a bit of a wake-up call for all the unions about the possibility. I think there's a real fear, and even World Rugby have admitted this. There was a real fear about that proposal, about the control and where it would go, and if you get deep down into it, the security around that. But I think the appetite is certainly growing with the pandemic that's going on at the moment, that it's the way to go. And it's really interesting that there's not a lot of difference in both manifestos of Gus Pichot's and Bill Beaumont's. So it's hard to kind of look at each manifesto and their proposals and say, well, I'm going to vote for one or the other, because they're quite similar. I think player welfare is a big part of it. The global season, the Nations League, all that kind of stuff. I think one kind of issue and mistake that's obviously has been addressed since is Bill Beaumont has kind of aligned himself with Bernard Laporte, who he wants to be his vice chairman. And Laporte came out a number of weeks ago talking about a World Club Championship, which would replace the European Cup. And that certainly ruffled a few feathers and wasn't that popular the way he came out and said it. He's quite powerful, Bernard Laporte. You see what he did to get France to 2023 World Cup after South Africa were the recommended bid or the recommended country to host the World Cup. He kind of stifled those plans and got France. So he's quite powerful, can influence a lot of people, and that kind of rocked Bill Beaumont's bid a little bit, and also the fact that they aligned themselves. Fiji are going to vote for Bill Beaumont, and they aligned themselves. There's obviously there's controversy there with filling one of the executive committee positions with the controversial Fijian Francis Keane, who has a bit of a checkered past of homophobia and accusations of manslaughter, a cover up there, and all that kind of stuff. He has since been removed from that nomination, so they've tried to clean up their act a little bit. But I think Bill Beaumont is probably a safer pair of hands. Gus Pichot is certainly going to bring a huge amount of enthusiasm and vision, I suppose. But it's hard for each union. It's quite difficult, I think, to kind of decipher from both their bids who's going to do what different.
isn't that the problem here? That there's no shared, clear vision for what the future of rugby should look like? Because you see the Premiership clubs in England wielding so much power with the union, and the union really struggling financially, which is bizarre to me when you think about it. I was on the way in going, of all of the unions in the world, for the English RFU to be struggling to break even, make profit, when you consider that they have like the biggest tradition, the biggest playing base, the most access to capital of anybody. They're based in London, where there is money sloshing around the place, and particularly for the demographic that the rugby people come from, who are running that sport. It is ludicrous that they are so weak and that they have allowed the clubs to become so strong. This is all leading to the question about centralised contracts and whether or not there should just be centralised contracts, which would elevate the international game, and then you'd have the club game, and then you'd have grassroots football, grassroots rugby feeding everything else. But there's no shared vision that there should be a sport that is controlled at the national level with centralised contracts. It just doesn't exist. There's no agreement that has to be the future of the sport, and that's the problem here.
And that is the problem, I think. And it's England and France are probably the two club nations that, with their clubs, that kind of dictate that status quo, if you like, that the clubs are in so much power and control. They're owned by private, the vast majority are owned by privately owned, and they dictate when their players are available, and the RFU have to negotiate with them and reimburse them for use of their international players. So it's the same in France. I think there has been a little bit more unison in France in the last couple of seasons around the release of the international players. But ultimately, Jared, this will be decided by the clubs and a wrestle for power, really, which is, I think Gus Pichot's arguing a lot for change around that, particularly for, the control that maybe England and France have over the governing body and the decisions that are made. A lot of these guys are on these executive committees are involved with clubs as well, and maybe their clubs are more important to them than the international game. And I think that's maybe buoyed was some resistance last year again to the Nations League, because you can understand if the Gallagher Premiership, they want to protect that tournament, and they want to make sure that their clubs are sustainable and viable. And it's a very tricky situation. I don't have the answers, because the players are being dragged in the middle of this new Nations League, obviously, because, if there is more fixtures and if there's more international games, and that they become very meaningful games now, whereas before there would have been you would be able to maneuver a little bit and rest players. The clubs will see less of their players. The traditional June test window for summer tours is moved this year for the first time to July. That was with a view to giving the players some rest, and with a view to player welfare. But there's so many elements to this. It's I think the big point here, Ger, is, like we said at the start, it's the financial possibilities here with broadcasters, with sponsors, and CVC were behind this proposed takeover and a massive push for this Nations League last year. I think the unions will now see the reality really is, I think that rugby needs to go to this space to try and make it more of an attractive global game and to maximise the financial possibilities there. And you can just imagine, and I've been on summer tours and played November internationals, and I never looked at them as friendlies. I always thought that they were, competitive. But ultimately, there's no trophy, there's no points at the end of those games. They're really test matches. With a Nations League, obviously, if you have points on the board and points available, they become certainly not any more viable to the players, because I think the players who play in these tests put a huge amount of pride into them, and they're seen as ultra competitive. But I think to people outside the game, they will see a tangible result or points available and league points and positions in leagues and stuff like that. So it doesn't really add more international games. It just makes these games certainly puts more at stake in them. So I think that's somewhere, whoever wins this, Bill Beaumont or Gus Pichot, I think we're looking at the real probability of a Nations League, and the realization that a lot of the unions can maximise their finances in a lot more from the possibilities around that. I think there's still going to be a real worry and a fear for Tier 2 nations. I know both men have put proposals in about more support for Tier 2 nations, more regular fixtures. But that was part of the debate last year as well. You know, do you bring Japan? I think Japan and USA were going to be added to the 10 Tier 1 nations, and that's the way it was going to start off. But how do you select those? You know, USA and Japan jumping into those 12, and where's that going to leave the other unions, the Tier 2 nations? Is there going to create more of a gap? But it'll be interesting to see how it happens. The voting will finish on Thursday, and we won't know the result for 2 weeks. But I think we're certainly going to see some change in the global game.
What about the Club World Cup, Alan? If you were back in your playing days right now, is that something you would favour? I guess you mentioned Japan and the USA as well. They would both have teams involved in this. This is clearly an effort to try and reach the global game, the club game, into a more global sphere. Yeah,
I think from a player, like as a player, you'd love to have the opportunity to play against club teams across the world and play against Australian, South African, New Zealand teams in a competition. I think the problem here, Owen, is where do you find the time? And I think Bernard Laporte, when he came out a couple of weeks ago, and he said that Bill Beaumont has since said he's been misinterpreted. I hope he has, because I think my big issue there was you cannot get rid of the European Cup. I think the European Cup has been fantastic. I think it has some flaws, like all competitions. The Pro 14 has flaws. The Gallagher Premiership has flaws. But the European game, I think, is incredible. I think it runs smoothly. I think the travel scenario, teams flying in and out of France, you can get over and back in 48 hours and play your match and stuff like that. You know, if you're playing Southern Hemisphere teams, you're going to be heading off for a number of weeks. Where are you going to find the time for that? I think he came out, Laporte, and changed initially what he said and ratified it in a different way, that he was looking at maybe doing this every couple of years, like a World Cup for international teams, that you do a World Championship for club teams, which finding a window for that is probably more feasible. And I think it'd be an incredible opportunity for clubs to qualify for something like that and play in a club world tournament. But regards every year, I just think the logistics of that and what do Pro 14 say, what do the Gallagher Premiership say, what do the top 14 say if 2 or 3 teams out of each competition has gone on a world club tour for 6 weeks, and you know they've got to continue on and play in their respective leagues and stuff like that. So with all this talk that's going on about the Nations League for internationals and maybe a World Club Championship possibilities, I think something will happen. And I think there is a realization that for rugby to be more financially viable and stable, that ways need to be looked at generating more finances and make the game more attractive and more globally connected, if you like. And maybe I like the idea of what Pichot's saying about, you know, international teams and maybe Lions tours going to different countries and you know, spreading the game, because I think you know, you look at football, it's a global game. It's in every country. Everybody loves it. Everybody knows about it. Rugby is not the same. And I think the challenge is to try and make rugby more attractive right across the international world, if you like, which it is a challenge. You know, you have your traditional rugby playing nations, and we've seen a lot of growth and you know what Japan did at the World Cup. took the world by storm, really. USA is probably a sleeping giant with the athletes they have there and probably the resources maybe that they can create. But I think you were definitely going to see some change. But like I said, both their manifestos talk a lot about change and the need for change. So it's a kind of a North versus South scenario where the Northern Hemisphere are back in Bill Beaumont, the Southern Hemisphere are back in Agustin Pichot.
And we've got to wait 2 weeks to find out exactly what happens. It looks like Ireland, according to Roy O'Connor today, have voted for Bill Beaumont. So look, we're out of time with this, but it does seem remarkable to me that all of a sudden Bill Beaumont's going to be an agent of change when he's been sitting there for the last couple of years and not that much.
Well, to be fair, Ger, he was pro the Nations League, and I think there is a big realization that he's got to implement change, and there is this perception about rugby and all the different unions that it's run by kind of older people with very set mindsets who want to keep that control. If he wants to get support and garner support, and I know he's tried to do that in the last few weeks, he's got to make sure that he lets people have their voices and have their opinions. I think that's what Pichot has done. He's been really open about how he wants more equality right across the game. You look at the Six Nations and the Tier 1 nations, they've got 3 votes. Tier 2 nations have got 1 vote. That is unfair, and it's something that probably needs to change. So it's like a politician getting the top job. Whoever gets this, they've got to back up what they say and what they say they're going to implement. But it's a minefield of decision makers out there who can object, and you need people to agree to decision and change. So hopefully we will see some change in a positive way.
Good stuff, Alan. Thanks a million for joining us this morning.